The Royal Canadian Mounted Police does not use the word cold. Inside the force, an unsolved murder is filed as a historical case, and by the numbers the force itself has released over the years, there are more than 1,000 of those files sitting open in British Columbia alone, with hundreds more spread across Alberta, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. Some of them are thin, a folder holding a single witness statement and a map with one circle drawn on it. Some of them fill entire shelves. Every one of them has a person inside it, and a family somewhere still waiting for a phone call that has not come in 20, 40, in one case, more than 90 years. Tonight I want to walk you through 6 of those files. 6 cases from the northern half of this continent that the Mounties opened, worked, and could not close. A family of 4 who climbed into a stranger's vehicle in Prince George one summer night in 1989 and drove out of the world. A man who fought the largest manhunt in the history of the Canadian Arctic to a standstill in 1932, died in the snow, and has still, to this day, never been identified. 2 disappearances along a single stretch of highway, 8 years apart, that may or may not belong to the same darkness. A murdered man who lay without a name in an Alberta farm field case file for 44 years before scientists finally gave him one back, and a young mother whose last minutes were captured by pure accident on a recording that the police later played for the entire country, hoping someone would recognize the second voice on the line. That recording still exists. You will hear about it before this night is over. This is a long episode. It is built to be listened to slowly, in low light, the way these stories deserve to be told. So settle in, and let me tell you exactly where we are going. First, the Jack family of Prince George, British Columbia, 4 people, including a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old, gone since the 2nd of August 1989, in a case where investigators were still digging in the bush as recently as the last few years. Second, the man history calls the Mad Trapper of Rat River, killed by police on a frozen river in February of 1932, exhumed in 2000. A quick word on how this channel works before we begin. Everything you are about to hear comes from the public record. Police statements, court documents, coroner findings, and the newspaper reporting of the day. Where that record goes quiet, I will tell you it goes quiet, and I will not fill the silence with guesses. No one who has not been formally charged will be named as a suspect tonight. These are real people with real families, and that is the only way this channel will ever tell their stories. The first file opens with a phone call a little before midnight. It is the night of August 1st, 1989, in Prince George, British Columbia, a mill town of around 70,000 people sitting at the junction of 2 rivers and 2 highways in the province's rough interior. In 1989, Prince George was the working capital of the northern interior, a city built on pulp mills and sawmills, where the smell of the mills hung over the bowl of the valley and the fortunes of every family rose and fell with the price of lumber. And in the late 80s, lumber was not kind. Mills were laying men off. Shifts were being cut, and for a young father without seniority, steady work was something you chased, not something you had. Ronald Jack is 26 years old. He and his wife Doreen, also 26, are raising 2 boys, Russell, who is 9, and Ryan, who is 4. Both Ronald and Doreen came from First Nations families with deep roots in the region, Ronald from the Nakasdili community near Fort St. Nan, James, Doreen from the Saikuz First Nation near Vanderhoof, and both had large extended families within an hour or 2 of the city. The kind of families where cousins are raised like siblings and nobody disappears from a gathering without being missed. Money is tight, the way it is tight for a lot of young families in a resource town when the work runs thin. Sometime around midnight, Ronald picks up a phone and calls a relative with what sounds like good news. A man has offered him work, a job at a camp outside town, and the whole family can come along. They will be gone a short while and then they will be back. That phone call is, for all practical purposes, the last confirmed trace of the Jack family. Stop on that phone call for a moment because everything about this case hangs on it. Camp work was the lifeblood of the North, and a job offer that came through a stranger in a bar or through a friend of a friend was not unusual. What was unusual, and what investigators have circled for 35 years, is the shape of this particular offer. It came at night. It required leaving immediately in the small hours before anyone could ask questions. And it included the whole family, the wife, the 9-year-old, the 4-year-old, which no legitimate bush camp in 1989 would have wanted or allowed. A real logging camp does not have room for a 4-year-old. Whoever made that offer was not hiring a worker. He was collecting a family. And he built the offer so that all 4 of them would climb into his vehicle willingly, together, with no struggle and no witnesses. At some point in the small hours of August 2nd, according to the account investigators later assembled, Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan left their home and got into a vehicle with a man whose name, 3.5 decades later, has never been publicly established. They did not return in a few days. They did not return at all. No camp ever reported them arriving. No employer ever came forward to say the job was real. 4 people stepped out their own front door in the middle of a Canadian summer night and simply ceased to appear in any record anywhere ever again. No bank activity, no medical visits. Russell never showed up for another day of school. And here the file carries a second wound, one the family has spoken about publicly for decades. The disappearance was not treated as an emergency. When relatives reported the family missing, the initial assessment leaned toward the idea that they had simply moved on, gone to find work somewhere, and would surface. Weeks became months. The critical window. The first days when tire tracks are fresh and memories are sharp and a stranger's vehicle might still be remembered at a gas pump. Closed without a full-scale investigation ever opening. By the time the file was being worked as the crime a family always believed it was, the trail was more than a year cold, and the man on the other end of that midnight phone call had been given the one thing he needed most: time. Now, here's the detail that has kept this case alive in the RCMP's historical files rather than letting it fade into an assumption. It is one thing for an adult to walk away from a life. It happens. It is another thing entirely for 2 adults and 2 small children to do it together, instantly, without money, without contacting a single member of either extended family ever again. Doreen was close to her relatives. The boys had grandparents. There were birthdays, funerals, Christmases, 3.5 decades of family events, and not one card, not one collect call, not one sighting that ever checked out. Investigators have said publicly, over the years, that they do not believe the Jack family left voluntarily, and the file is worked as a suspected homicide of all 4. The investigation itself has come in waves. There were interviews through the 90s, tips that pointed at logging roads and gravel pits in the endless timber country that surrounds Prince George in every direction. The province of British Columbia has posted a substantial reward for information, and the searching has never fully stopped. Within just the last few years, search teams acting on tip information have gone back into rural ground outside the city with excavators and dogs, working specific sites. In 2023, RCMP investigators spent days excavating a rural property in the Cluchalls Lake area west of Prince George, moving earth with heavy machinery, sifting it, working cadaver dogs across the ground, all on the strength of information that had come in. They did not announce a recovery. But think about what that operation tells you. It tells you the file is not sitting in a basement. It tells you the tips are specific enough to justify renting excavators. Somebody, somewhere has been talking in fragments for 35 years. And the police have been listening and testing what they hear against dirt and rock. Think about the geography for a moment, because in northern cases the geography is never just scenery. Prince George sits inside a working forest bigger than most European countries. Thousands of kilometers of logging spurs, decommissioned roads grown over with alder, cut blocks that were planted in 1990 and are now 40 feet tall. A vehicle can leave that city in any of 6 directions and be on gravel within 20 minutes, and beyond the reach of any casual witness within 40. And that forest does not hold still. Roads are deactivated, culverts pulled, bridges removed, whole networks of spurs surrendered back to the bush on a schedule. A site that was a bare gravel landing in August of 1989 is, today, a stand of trees taller than a house, and even a person who once knew exactly where something happened might struggle to walk back to the spot. That is what the investigators are racing. Not just the death of witnesses, but the forest itself slowly erasing the map. Whoever picked up the Jack family understood that country. That midnight job offer was aimed at a young father who needed work. And it was aimed well. Doreen's mother spent the rest of her life looking for her daughter and her grandsons. The family still marks the anniversary, and Ronald's surviving relatives have stood in front of cameras year after year, asking the same question into the same microphones. Russell would be in his mid-40s now. Ryan would be about 40. If they had lived, they would likely have children of their own, a whole generation that simply does not exist. Somewhere out in that timber, in all likelihood, is a place the four people never left, and at least one person has known its location since the summer of 1989. The Mounties are still asking that person to speak. So far, the forest has been the only one holding the answer. From a case where we know exactly who the victims were and nothing about the man who took them, we go now to a case that is the perfect mirror image. A man the police caught, shot, photographed, buried, and even dug back up, and about whom they still cannot answer the first question on any file. His name. On the 9th of July, 1931, a stranger floated down the Peel River on a raft of 3 logs and came ashore near Fort McPherson in the Northwest Territories, about 130 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. He gave his name, when pressed, as Albert Johnson. He was somewhere in his mid-30s to early 40s, stocky, blue-eyed, and he spoke as little as a human being can speak and still buy supplies. The Hudson's Bay Company trader who dealt with him remembered the transaction for the rest of his life, a man who answered questions with silence or single words, who bought a shotgun, shells, and supplies, and who wanted nothing to do with any other human being. He paid for those supplies from a sizable roll of cash, which was its own kind of strange in the second year of the Great Depression, when cash money in the far north was rarer than gold dust, then built himself a small, heavily reinforced cabin on the Rat River and settled in alone. And that cabin deserves a moment of attention, because it was not a normal trapper's cabin. It was dug 2 feet down into the earth, so a man inside could stand below the level of the walls, with logs a rifle bullet could not reliably penetrate. He had not built a home. He had built a fortification, a full 6 months before anyone came looking for him. Whatever Albert Johnson was expecting, he had been expecting it for a long time. That winter, local Gwich'in trappers complained that someone was interfering with their trap lines, springing traps and hanging them in trees, and the complaints pointed toward the silent man on the Rat. A few days after Christmas, on the 31st of December 1931, 2 RCMP constables came down river by dog team with a search warrant. When Constable Alfred King knocked, Johnson answered through the closed door with a rifle shot that tore through the wood and into King's chest. King survived, barely, hauled 80 kilometers back to Aklavik by dog sled through deep cold, a 20-hour run that his partner drove without rest, and the surgeon at Aklavik later said that the cold itself may have saved King's life by slowing the bleeding. And with that single shot, Albert Johnson started the largest manhunt the Canadian North had ever seen. What followed reads like it was invented, and it was not. A 9-man posse returned with 20 pounds of dynamite and laid siege to the cabin for 15 hours in temperatures around 40 below, and Johnson, firing from pits he had dug beneath his own floor, drove them off. They thawed the dynamite against their own bodies to keep it usable, hurled it at the cabin, and finally blew the roof in, and when 2 men rushed the breach with flashlights, Johnson, half buried in the wreckage of his own home, shot at them from the floor and drove them back into the dark. When they came back in force, the cabin was blown apart, and Johnson had vanished into the delta. For weeks he moved through some of the most hostile terrain on the planet, in one of the coldest winters on record in the region, with the temperature sitting between -40 and -50 for days at a time, while dozens of police, trappers, and Gwich'in trackers, the best in the north, tried to close a ring around him. He ran on snowshoes, doubled back on his own trail, walked on bare wind, scoured ice where no print would hold. On the 30th of January, 1932, When a patrol caught up to him in a creek bed, he shot and killed Constable Edgar Mellon, a well-liked officer who had actually met Johnson the previous summer and had been chosen for the hunt partly because Johnson had once spoken a few words to him. And then Johnson did something the men chasing him considered close to impossible. In the dead of an Arctic winter with the temperature falling past -40 and a blizzard running, Albert Johnson climbed the Richardson Mountains, on foot, on snowshoes, through a pass, and came down the other side into the Yukon, while eating almost nothing and sleeping in snow holes with no fire, because a fire would give him away. Local men said it could not be done. The blizzard that should have killed him instead erased his tracks and carried him over the divide. The RCMP did something unprecedented in response. They hired a famous bush pilot, the First World War veteran, Wap May, a man who nearly 14 years earlier had been the Red Baron's final intended victim in the skies over France, and for the first time in Canadian history, an aircraft joined a manhunt. May flew a Belenca monoplane, ferrying supplies, spotting from the air, collapsing distances that took the ground team's days into minutes. It was May from the air who solved the trick that had baffled the trackers. Johnson had been walking in the packed trails of migrating caribou herds, letting 1,000 hooves erase his snowshoe prints. On the 17th of February, 1932, the posse came around a bend of the Eagle River and met him in the open, by pure chance, a man in the middle of the frozen river with nowhere to hide. Johnson dropped his pack, tried to run for the bank, then turned and dug in behind the pack in the snow. In the final exchange of fire, Johnson badly wounded Sergeant Earl Hersey, shooting him through the knee, elbow, and chest with what may have been a single bullet, and the posse's bullets killed Johnson where he lay behind his pack in the snow. He was hit multiple times, the fatal shot striking him as he lay prone, still working the action of his rifle. Hersey lived partly because Wap May landed on the river ice within minutes and flew him to the hospital at Aklavik, a flight that covered in under an hour a distance that would have taken days by dog team and would certainly have killed him. The whole pursuit had lasted 48 days and covered roughly 240 kilometers of Arctic wilderness, and through all of it, Johnson is not known to have spoken one single word to his pursuers. Not a shout, not a curse, not a demand. The only sounds anyone ever attributed to him in those 48 days were rifle shots and, one account claims, a single burst of laughter after he killed Mellon. And now the case begins. Because it did not end on the Eagle River. It has never ended. On the body, police found over $2,000 in cash, a fortune in 1932, the equivalent of several years of a working man's wages, along with some gold, including gold dental work that appeared to have been pried out of someone's mouth, possibly his own, a pocket compass, fish hooks, a dead squirrel, and not one single scrap of identification. No letters, no photographs, no name sewn into a coat. His fingerprints matched nothing on file in Canada or the United States. The name Albert Johnson connected to no missing person anywhere. The famous death photograph, the gaunt, frostbitten face twisted into what looks like a grin, ran in newspapers across the continent. And no one, not one person on a continent of 130 million people, wrote in to say, "I know that man." The man had erased himself so completely that investigators could not even establish his nationality. For 75 years that was where it sat, while researchers argued over candidates, a Norwegian here, a North Dakota fugitive there. The strongest names put forward over the decades included Johnny Johnson, a Norwegian-born criminal who had served time in Folsom Prison, and a North Dakota farm boy named Arthur Nelson who had drifted through the Yukon in the 20s buying guns and speaking to almost no one. Then, in August of 2007, with the community's permission, a forensic team exhumed the grave at Fort McPherson for a documentary investigation. They recovered DNA from the remains, which the permafrost had kept in remarkable condition. They studied his teeth, which showed expensive gold dental work of a sophistication that startled the odontologists, bridgework of a kind associated with wealthy patients and skilled urban dentists, the mouth of a man who had once had money and lived somewhere with good dentists, which sits very strangely on a silent hermit in a dugout cabin. Isotope analysis of his remains, reading the chemical signature that drinking water and diet leave in teeth and bone during childhood, suggested, according to the researchers involved, that he likely grew up in the American Midwest or possibly Scandinavia, that he had eaten a corn-heavy diet consistent with the United States rather than Canada, and that he was likely younger than the posse had guessed, possibly in his early 30s. The DNA was compared against the descendants of every serious candidate family. Every single comparison came back negative. Every name history had offered was crossed off, and the file was left emptier than before. So here is where the file stands, more than 90 years on. Canada knows exactly where this man is buried. It has his genome. It knows what he ate as a child, roughly where the water he drank as a boy came out of the ground. And it still cannot tell you who he was, why he came down the peel on 3 logs, why he shot a policeman through a closed door rather than accept a fine of a few dollars, or what or who he was running from, so hard that he outran his own name. Genetic genealogy has cracked cases far colder than 1932. The technique that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018 works by finding distant cousins in public DNA databases and building family trees backward toward a single unknown person, and it has since put names on unidentified remains from the 19-teens. Somewhere out there, almost certainly, are living relatives whose family tree has a silent gap in it, a great uncle who went west and never wrote again, until one of them tests. The man in the Fort McPherson grave keeps his secret. I told you earlier that 2 of tonight's cases might be connected to each other by a single stretch of road. We have arrived at that road. It runs 700 kilometers east to west across the interior of British Columbia, from Prince George to the coast at Prince Rupert, through Vanderhoof, Burns Lake, Houston, Smithers, and the Hazeltons. It is a beautiful road, running through river valleys under coastal mountains, and it is a lonely one, long dark gaps between small towns, patchy cell coverage even today, and for decades no public transit at all connecting the communities along it. On the map it is Highway 16. In the mouths of the people who live along it, for a generation now, it has carried another name, the Highway of Tears. Ramona Lisa Wilson was 16 years old in June of 1994. She was Gitson, one of 5 children, raised by her mother Matilda in Smithers, a small town of about 5,000 people sitting in the shadow of Hudson Bay Mountain about halfway along that highway. The people who knew her describe a warm, outgoing teenager, a girl who loved her friends and was loved back, who wrote poetry, who was close to her mother. On the evening of Saturday, June 11, 1994, Ramona set out to meet a friend with a dance to go to. Getting around the Bulkley Valley without a car, for young people there and then often meant walking the highway shoulder or catching rides, because there was little other way to move between the towns. There was no bus. There was no taxi a teenager could afford. Hitchhiking was not recklessness. It was infrastructure. The only transit system the valley had, and everyone used it, which meant that every predator who drove that road knew exactly where to find people standing alone with their thumb out. She never reached her friend. Matilda Wilson reported her daughter missing, and here the record shows a pattern that the RCMP itself has since acknowledged in this era along this highway and far too many files. The early response did not match the emergency. There were suggestions that Ramona might have taken off on her own, that she was a runaway, that she would turn up. Her family knew better, and her family, more than anyone, kept the search alive through that summer, and that fall, and that winter, organizing search parties, printing posters with money they did not have, walking ditch lines along the highway themselves, a mother and her children searching the grass for their own. Matilda has said that she knew within days that her daughter was gone because Ramona would never have left without a word. The system took far longer to believe her. In April of 1995, 10 months after she vanished, Ramona's remains were found near the Smithers Airport, only a few kilometers from town, close beside the highway she had grown up along. She had been there, in all likelihood, since the night she disappeared, through an entire winter of her family searching within sight of the mountain she was raised under. Her death was a homicide. No one has ever been charged. In 2005 and 2006, the RCMP formally created a special investigation called Project E. Pana, drawing the name from an Inuit word associated with the spirit that cares for souls before they move on. Its mandate was to re-examine a series of unsolved murders and disappearances of women and girls connected to Highway 16 and two other northern routes, Highways 97 and 5, cases running from 1969 into the 2000s. The official list eventually settled at 18 victims, 13 murders, and 5 disappearances, chosen by strict criteria. The victim had to be female, engaged in a high-risk activity such as hitchhiking, and last seen or found within roughly a mile of one of the 3 highways. Ramona's file is one of them. At its height, the project had more than 50 investigators assigned and had spent tens of millions of dollars. It pulled the old boxes, reran exhibits with modern DNA, techniques that did not exist in 1994, rebuilt timelines, and cross-referenced hundreds of offenders who had moved through the corridor, prison records against work camp rosters against gas receipts. It has produced results in a small number of the files over the years. In 2012, the project announced that DNA had linked a deceased American convict named Bobby Jack Fowler to the 1974 murder of Colleen McMillan, one of the 18, and named him a strong suspect in others from that era. But Fowler could not have killed Ramona. He was in prison in the United States in 1994. Whoever took Ramona Wilson is someone else, and in her file, publicly at least, E. Pana has not produced a name. Every June on the anniversary, Matilda Wilson has led a memorial walk along Highway 16 in her daughter's name, and she has done it for 3 decades now, in the rain some years, in heat others, carrying a mother's grief up and down the shoulder of the road that took her child. She has said in interview after interview the same simple thing. Somebody knows. Along a highway of small towns where everybody recognizes everybody's truck. Somebody is always known. And the reason the country eventually had to pay attention to this road is that Ramona's story was not singular. Depending on whether you use the official E. Pana list of 18 or the longer counts kept by the families and First Nations communities along the corridor, which run past 40, the number of women and girls lost on and around Highway 16 runs from the teens into the dozens, and a disproportionate number of them, like Ramona, were Indigenous. In 2006, a Highway of Tears symposium in Prince George produced a report with 33 recommendations, the first of which was simply a shuttle bus system so that no one would have to hitchhike between those towns. It took more than a decade for regular transit service to actually arrive on the highway. That reality, the poverty of options that put teenagers on the shoulder of a dangerous road, became part of the evidence heard by Canada's National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which delivered its final report in 2019 and used the word genocide. It is not a mystery in the entertainment sense. It is an open wound running through real communities, and tonight it deserves to be spoken of exactly that way. 8 years after Ramona was taken, the same highway swallowed someone else, at the far eastern end, and this time the story shows you the other face of the corridor. Nicole Hoar was 25 in the summer of 2002, a young woman from Red Deer, Alberta, with an arts degree and an easy laugh, spending her summer the way thousands of young Canadians do, planting trees in the clear cuts of the British Columbia interior. Tree planting is brutal, muddy, well-paid seasonal work. A good planter can put over 1,000 seedlings in the ground in a day, and the camps are full of students and travelers. Nicole was working out of a camp near Prince George. On Friday, June 21, 2002, the first day of summer, she set out to hitchhike west along Highway 16 to Smithers to surprise her sister who lived there. Hitchhiking was, and remained, a normal way for planters without vehicles to move along that corridor, in spite of everything the road's name already meant. She was last seen at a gas station on the western outskirts of Prince George by the highway shoulder wearing her